for any IT professional, developer, or even a student who needs to run multiple operating systems or develop applications, and also if you are preparing for any certifications, creating a virtual lab has many benefits and it is easier than you might think. For anyone who uses Windows desktop or laptop computer, VMware Workstation is a go-to tool for creating a virtual lab and running multiple operating systems at the same time. Hey, my name is Kiran and I work as a technical lead in one of the IT companies. I've been working in the virtualization technologies such as VMware Workstation, ESXi, Hyper-V, and others for more than 13 years now. By end of this video, you will be confident to create your virtual lab for testing, training, development, and certification purposes. So sit tight, grab your favorite drink, and enjoy this learning. I'm going to show you a lot of demos, but before that, I will discuss the topics that I'll discuss in this video. First, we start off with the use cases of building a virtual lab and how it is going to help you. I will then talk about the hardware requirements for installing VMware Workstation and what type of hardware is required for creating different types of virtual lab. I will show you the step-by-step instructions on installing VMware Workstation on a Windows computer. I will show you how to create your first virtual machine. I will talk about different networking configurations that you can perform with VMware Workstation and show them as well to simulate a data center network. And finally, we'll walk through the steps of building few virtual labs. By end of this course, you will have a virtual lab built with VMware Workstation, which can be used for all the benefits that it provides. There are a number of different use cases for virtual labs, but I have to say, being a lifelong learner, learning new technologies quickly is one of my favorite things to do. Whatever you want to study, whether it's vSphere, Windows or Linux, containers and Kubernetes, or C-hash development, you can learn it fast and easily in a virtual lab. Then there is the use case for testing. Virtual labs help you in preventing the issues before they happen in a production environment. Whatever you want to test, whether it's updates, integrations, or operating system upgrades, you can do it in a virtual lab. The ability to take snapshots, test, and then roll back is an amazing feature in virtual labs. If in case your testing fails, you can restore your virtual lab back to the original state from where you initially deployed it by reverting to a snapshot and then retesting it. You will be able to test your update or configuration modification until it is successful in this manner. Then there is the use case of demos where you can showcase your software, solutions, or even your expertise. Being able to do this is incredibly effective for system administrators, developers, sales agents, or students for that matter. The use cases of the virtual labs are endless and it can be used for many different purposes. When it comes to hardware requirements, it depends on multiple factors. Of course, you need things such as more RAM, a better processor, a faster hard disks on a computer where you are going to install VMware Workstation. But there are three things that you need to consider before the hardware requirements can be listed out. The first thing, you need to identify your goal. Why do you need to build a virtual lab? What is your use case? What type of virtual machines you are going to run in the lab? The second thing, you need to design your lab. What type of hardware you need and how much you are going to spend to build your computer to create the lab. How you are going to build and design the lab. Finally, you need to use the lab. Of course, the last reason sounds obvious because a virtual lab is more like a blank paper where you just have to start writing and creating to actually use it. So back to identifying your goal, you need to know what type of applications or virtual machines you're running. Maybe you are an IT professional and wanted to learn a technology that requires spinning up virtual machines. It can be just one single virtual machine or multiple virtual machines. You also need to know what are the other things required for those virtual machines. It can be network, DNS, network time protocol, or may need interaction with other virtual machines within the same lab. The lab can be a simple setup where you just need a front end web server and a database server. A good starting point is to look at the hardware and software requirements of technology and understand how effectively you can simulate a physical setup as a virtual lab. So it all depends on what technology you're going to learn or test. From there, while designing the lab, you need to again look at the requirements of the operating systems that will be deployed on the virtual machines. Depending on the number of virtual machines and their hardware specifications, you may need more RAM, a multi core processor, and faster hard disks such as SSDs and NVMe disks. Again, depending on how big you want your lab to be. I will talk about what type of computer you need for creating a lab. And then finally, you need to start using the labs and take advantage of these labs as a developer or as an IT professional. Now for this video, I'm going to use VMware Workstation Pro version 16 on a Windows 10 laptop. But the process would be the same for Linux OS as well as for the older versions of VMware Workstation. So let's talk about the hardware requirements. By the way, if you're using Mac OS X, I'm sorry, you cannot use VMware Workstation Pro on Mac OS X. But you can use another product from VMware called VMware Fusion, which provides almost the same set of features as VMware Workstation Pro. To start off, I will list out the CPU requirements. Your computer needs to have either Intel or AMD processor, as both are supported for VMware Workstation. Any of these processors launched in 2011 or later would work, and they include Intel processors such as Core i3, Core i5, Core i7, and Core i9. Any new AMD processors are also supported. Now, for running a 64-bit operating system, the processor must support Intel VTX technology if you're using Intel processors, or AMD V technology if you're using an AMD processor. These two technologies are virtualization technologies, and they are important for running virtual machines. By the way, any new processor does contain this feature. This virtualization technology must be enabled in the BIOS. So to access the BIOS, you need to reboot your computer, and while booting up, press a specific key to enter into the BIOS setup. In the screenshot, you can see it is the delete button. For each computer, it differs. It can be F10, F11, F2, or F12. You need to refer to the manual of your PC manufacturer. Once you are in BIOS, you typically see an option that says Intel Virtualization Technology, and that must be enabled. If you don't see an option, then please check the manual of your PC manufacturer. After making the changes, save it and reboot the computer. For the host OS requirements where you will install VMware Workstation, both Windows and Linux OS can be used. Any latest version of these operating systems would be fine. For the storage requirements on the host OS, you can use pretty much all types of disks, starting from IDE disk, SATA disk, SCSI disk, and the faster SSD and NVMe disks. But you need at least 2 GB of free space on your host OS to install VMware Workstation. Moving on, for the memory requirements on the host OS, you need enough memory to run your virtual machines and the applications that you install on top of them. When I say enough memory, it depends. And for that, you need to consider the memory requirements for the guest OS and applications on top of the virtual machines. You need to consider the number of virtual machines that you will run on your host OS inside of the VMware Workstation. You also need to take the memory consumption of your host OS and the applications you run while running the VMware Workstation along with the virtual machines. All these are considered to estimate how much memory you require on your host OS. But the minimum memory required is 2 GB and the recommended memory required on the host system is 4 GB and above. This minimum and recommended requirements I would say are nowhere enough to run multiple virtual machines on your host OS. I will talk about the guidelines for the memory requirements in the next slide. And if you're using Windows graphics features such as Windows 7 Aero graphics in a virtual machine, then it needs at least 3 GB of memory. The display requirements on your host OS are standard. You need to have either a 16-bit or a 32-bit display adapter, and 32-bit is the common one. Make sure you have installed the latest graphic drivers on your host OS, whether you use an internal graphics adapter or an external graphics adapter. Windows 7 Aero graphics require NVIDIA or ATI Radeon graphics card. 3D benchmarks may not work properly in the virtual machine using certain graphic cards. For the network requirements on the host OS, any network adapter is supported regardless of speed. Here comes the general guidelines with all these requirements. You can either use a laptop or desktop computer and it is fine. Although a desktop computer is preferred because adding additional components into a desktop computer is much easier than a laptop computer. If you're using an assembled desktop computer, also called a white box, you can start with bare minimum specs, and if your lab requires more resources, you start adding things such as better CPU, more RAM, and faster disks. You just need to make sure that you buy a motherboard that supports more RAM, a better CPU, and faster disks. Overall, it should be future-proof. You can start with, let's say, Core i3 processor, which provides 4 cores or less, but this processor is least preferred for virtualization. However, you can use this if your virtual machine do not need extra CPU resources. If you have a Core i5 processor, it is much better than Core i3 as it provides additional cores of 4 to 6 cores. The only thing that is missing is a hyperthreading feature, which is best suited for certain types of virtual machines and certain types of computational tasks that run in a guest OS. But if you have a Core i7 or Core i9 processor, it is the best desktop processor for virtualization as it provides 8 or more cores and also the hyperthreading feature. You can also use an Intel Xeon processor, which is a server class processor if your motherboard supports it. For learning and testing purposes, either Core i5, Core i7 or Core i9 best suits. If you're planning to run more virtual machines, then you need more memory. Like I said before, you need to consider how much memory you need to run the guest OS and the applications inside the virtual machines. You can start with 16 gig, 32 gig or 64 gig of RAM. But always use a motherboard that supports more memory and better CPU to make it future-proof. For storing the virtual machine, you can use any disks, but I suggest storing them on a dedicated drive. If you are using NVMe or SSD disks that have faster read-writes, and it means your virtual machine will boot and respond faster. Another thing about storing these VM files, when you create these VMs, you select the options to split the virtual disks into multiple files if you are using a faster disk such as SSD or NVMe disks to save the space. Otherwise, you can store them as a single virtual disk if you are using slower disks to get optimized disk response. I will show you this little later. Before I jump in and show you the installation of VMware Workstation, let me talk about two different editions of VMware Workstation. VMware Workstation comes in two different editions, VMware Workstation Player and VMware Workstation Pro. Workstation Player still allows you to run over 200 different operating systems in a virtual machine, which is great. You can also create large virtual machines with 32 vCPUs and 128 GB of RAM. Workstation Player supports high-resolution 4K video and it has CLI as well as API support. So you can script things, you can run commands and bring up virtual machines, create virtual machines, and there is a number of other features that Workstation supports, such as host guest file sharing, running virtual machines in different view modes, USB 3.0 support, the ability to run managed or restricted desktops. On the other hand, you have advanced version of Workstation Player, which is VMware Workstation Pro. It includes all of the features of Workstation Player plus the ability to run multiple virtual machines at the same time, whereas VMware Workstation Player does not allow you to run multiple VMs at the same time. With Workstation Pro, you also get this tab interface. You get the secure virtual machine encryption and the ability to use snapshots of the VMs, which is a must feature in a virtual lab. You can create custom virtual networking to simulate physical networks. You can clone, which is an amazing feature to quickly create VMs of same type in a virtual lab. Another great feature is the ability to connect and manage VMware ESXi hypervisor as well as vCenter server. For a full list of comparison, please visit this VMware link. In this course, I will be using VMware Workstation Pro exclusively, with the biggest reason being that it allows you to run multiple virtual machines at the same time. Enough of slides, it is time for our first demo. I'm going to download and install VMware Workstation Pro version 16 on my laptop. I'm in a web browser and I'll type download VMware Workstation Pro in Google search and click on the first VMware link that will bring up the download page for VMware Workstation. I will scroll down here and you can see we can download either for Windows or for Linux. I will click download now for Windows and it will download the setup file, which is around 600 meg in size. After the download completes, I will just click on the setup file. The setup notifies that Microsoft VC Redistributable had to be installed as one of the dependent package and it requires the system to be restarted. I will click yes and restart my laptop. After restarting the laptop, I will launch the setup again. I will click next on the welcome screen, accept the end user license agreement and click next. I will keep the default location for C program files, VMware, VMware Workstation and click next. I will keep the defaults for check for product updates on startup and join the VMware Customer Experience Improvement Program. Click next. I will also keep the defaults for adding shortcuts to the desktop and the start menu. With that, I will click next. In the ready to install screen, click install and wait for a few minutes to complete. So this is it. The installation of VMware Workstation Pro has completed. You can also license VMware Workstation by clicking the license button here, or I will show you another place where you can type in the license key. If you don't license the software, you can try VMware Workstation Pro for 30 days. Just click finish. Now on your desktop, you can see an icon for VMware Workstation Pro. I will double click on that and it will launch VMware Workstation Pro for the first time. So another place to enter the license key is Help menu and click Enter a license key. Here you can type the license key. I will click Cancel. This is how you download and install VMware Workstation Pro. Before I create my first virtual machine, I will talk about the supported guest operating systems in VMware Workstation. Make sure that the guest OS that you're installing in a VM is supported by VMware Workstation. Here on the VMware Workstation product page, if you select Resources and click on Documentation and Release Notes, it's here that you will find a link to the guest operating system installation guide. Click that. In here, you will find all the supported guest operating system, not just for VMware Workstation, but also for other hypervisors such as VMware ESXi, VMware Fusion, and VMware ACE products. And if you click on any of these operating systems, for example, if you select Windows 10, that will take us to the Windows 10 installation instructions, the steps, and then also known issues to know about installing VMware tools and any knowledge base articles that are specific to installing Windows 10 in a virtual machine. Another place to check is the VMware Compatibility matrix. For example, if I select Workstation as the product and 16 as the version, I will select Microsoft as the OS vendor. When I click Update and View Results, we get detailed information about all Windows operating systems that are supported as guest operating system for VMware Workstation version 16. So these are some ways to ensure that the guest operating systems are supported. Finally, we are going to create our first virtual machine. But one thing which is required to create a new VM is an ISO file of the guest operating system. For this demo, I've already downloaded a bootable ISO file of Windows 10 from the Microsoft website since I'm going to create a Windows 10 virtual machine. If you need to know how you can download an ISO file from the Microsoft website, then check out my YouTube video on this. I will leave a link for the video in the info link and in the video description as well. Okay, back to our demo. I have opened up VMware Workstation and we'll start the process of creating a new virtual machine by clicking on Create a New Virtual Machine, which opens up Welcome to the New Virtual Machine wizard. And we have two options here, Typical, Recommended, which is a recommended option, and Custom, Advanced, to create a custom virtual machine. To keep it simple, I will select Typical, Recommended and click Next. In this screen, select Installer Disk Image ISO and click on Browse. Navigate to the location where you have your ISO file and select that file. I will select my Windows 10 ISO file and click on Open and click Next. In the Easy Install Information screen, you can type in your Windows product key and you can select the version of Windows that you are going to install. And you can personalize your Windows by specifying the full name of the user who is going to use the virtual machine and the password. By specifying all this information, you can automate certain steps of the setup. I'm not going to specify anything here in the Easy Install screen. However, Easy Install is going to install Windows 10 automatically. I'm going to skip all this and click Next. And it says that I have to manually activate the Windows after the setup. So I'm going to click Yes. Name the virtual machine. I'll name this as Windows 10. For the location of the VM files, I will keep the default location, which is my user profile, documents, virtual machines, and a folder by the name of the virtual machine. But like I mentioned before, it is recommended to place them on a dedicated faster disk. I'll click Next. For the disk capacity of the virtual disk, I'm going to keep the default recommended for Windows 10, which is 60 GB in size. You also have an option to store the virtual disk as a single file or split them as multiple files. I'll again keep the default selected, which is split virtual disk into multiple files instead of storing it as one single virtual disk, because splitting the disk files improves the performance of the guest OS a little and also saves the disk space on the host OS. I will click Next here. In the Ready to Create Virtual Machine wizard, you can review the hardware specifications of this VM. So we are going to create a virtual machine with 60 gig virtual disk, 2 GB of memory, a NIC adapter connected to NAT Network, and with other devices such as virtual CD or DVD drives, USB controller, printer, sound card, and so on. I will not click on Customize Hardware to customize the hardware specification of the VM. I will not do that right now, and I will leave everything default. I will also keep the option Power on this virtual machine after creation checked. I'll just click Finish. And there we go. We just created our first virtual machine. It is being powered on. And we can see a message down here which says easy install is installing Windows 10 and later x64. Alright, you can see easy install is installing Windows 10 automatically. Now it's going to take a while because easy install is going to install and configure Windows 10 automatically. And you can also see it is installing the VMware tools automatically. There you go, Windows 10 is installed on a virtual machine in VMware Workstation, and all the setup was automatically performed by easy install feature of VMware Workstation. In the previous demo, you saw VMware Tools was installed automatically by easy install feature in VMware Workstation. But before starting this demo, I've gone ahead and uninstalled VMware Tools on my Windows 10 virtual machine because in this demo, I'm going to show you how you can manually install VMware Tools on a virtual machine. Soon after you create a virtual machine, it is recommended that you install VMware Tools for both Windows and Linux. VMware Tools is essentially a package that contains the drivers for your virtual devices, which helps improve the performance, especially the graphics and mouse movements. It helps to sync the guest OS mouse movement with the host OS, so that the mouse does not get locked inside the guest OS of the virtual machine. The mouse can get locked inside of the guest OS of the virtual machine, and sometimes you may not be able to move the mouse on your host OS. But in my case, I'm able to move the mouse from the guest OS to the host OS even without VMware Tools installed. However, if your mouse gets locked in the guest OS of the VM, you simply need to press Ctrl plus Alt at the same time. And you can see the message down here which says to return to your computer, press Ctrl plus Alt. So if I press Ctrl plus Alt, it will release the mouse from the guest OS just like that. You can see my mouse pointer changed because I came out of the virtual machine. And if you need the mouse to go back to the guest OS of the virtual machine, simply press Ctrl plus G and you can see the same message down here as well. So I'll press Ctrl plus G and the mouse is back to the VM. Also, the mouse has a bit of lag in the movement because the mouse is not synchronized with the host OS. VMware Tools solves these problems. It also allows you to do file and folder sharing between the host OS and the guest OS. So how do you manually install VMware Tools? Click on the VM menu and click on Install VMware Tools. And it will prompt inside of the guest OS to install VMware Tools. You can click the prompt and start the installation. Otherwise, you can open up Windows Explorer and navigate to this PC. You should be able to see VMware Tools ISO image mounted on the virtual CD or DVD drive of the virtual machine. Open it up and run the setup file of VMware Tools. Click Yes to allow the installer for making system changes. Click Next on the welcome screen. For the setup type, I will keep the default selected, which is typical, and click Next. Click Install to continue with the installation. Wait for the installation to complete. The installation is done. I can already notice the mouse is not lagging anymore. The mouse is easily coming out of the guest OS and the display is much better. Click Finish and restart the VM. After logging in, I can already see my user experience has improved a lot with the installation of VMware tools. If you go up to the VM menu, you can see it now says reinstall VMware tools, which means VMware tools has been installed. The next thing I will show you is how to configure or customize the devices for a virtual machine. For this Windows 10 virtual machine, I will click the VM menu and select Settings. In this window, you can configure and customize the virtual machine. Everything that you see here is virtual hardware provided by the hardware resources of the host OS. For this VM, we can see the standard virtual devices. By default, I have 2 gig of memory configured, which is recommended for this virtual machine. But if you see here, you can go all the way up to 32 gig, which is the maximum recommended memory, although you can even go higher than that by specifying the memory in megabytes up here. And just 4 MB is the minimum memory that you can assign for this virtual machine. I will set the recommended memory, which is 2 gig. How much memory you can assign to this virtual machine depends on the available maximum memory of your host computer. For example, if your host computer has 16 gig of total memory, you may not be able to assign more than 16 gig and run this virtual machine. In fact, you cannot assign all 16 gig of memory to your virtual machines from your host OS because the host OS also requires some memory to run the host OS and applications on top of it. That also includes VMware Workstation. Also, when the virtual machine is powered on, you cannot reduce the memory because the VM is running. But you can increase the memory for this VM if you prefer to do that. This VM also has 2 processors and each processor has 1 core. So there's a total of 2 cores available. You also see few other virtualization options which are disabled right now because the VM is currently running. One such option is virtualize Intel VTX or EPT or AMD V or RVI, which enables to run virtualization inside the guest OS. This is used for guest VMs running Hyper-V or ESXi where you want to run VMs inside the guest OS. It is also called as nested virtualization. And if you ever want to increase the vCPU count or the cores, then the VM should be powered off. The VM has a 60 gig virtual hard disk, but currently only 17 gig is being used because the virtual disk is thinly provisioned. Not all of 60 gig was immediately provisioned and allocated since we selected to split the virtual disk into multiple files. You also have disk utilities to map the virtual disk as a local volume on the host OS, and you can also defragment, expand, or compact the virtual disk. All these options will be enabled once we power off the VM. There is also a virtual CD or DVD drive that is connected to the Windows ISO image that we use to install the Windows 10 OS on this virtual machine. Next in the list is our network adapter, which is connected to the host IP address using network address translation called NAT. If you want to disconnect the network for this VM, you can disconnect it by unchecking it. You also have the option to connect the VM to other types of networks such as a bridge network, host-only network, or a specific VMnet custom network, or a LAN segment. I will select this back to NAT. You can also see a USB device and change the USB compatibility from 1.1 to 2.0 or 3.1. There are other devices such as sound card, printer, and display. In the display, you have an option to accelerate 3D graphics, use host settings for monitors, or specify maximum resolution. All these options can be changed if the VM is powered off. You can also specify the graphics memory that is actually taken from the host memory, and you can specify options for display scaling and stretching. You can also add new virtual hardware by clicking on Add and selecting the virtual hardware you need. You can add additional virtual disks, and you can specify things such as virtual disk type, and if you want to create a new disk or use an existing disk or use a physical disk. And then once you click next, you can also specify the size of the disk. You can also add additional network adapters and other types of virtual devices. So that's how easy it is to configure virtual hardware for your new virtual machine that is running in VMware Workstation. Let us talk about how you can access the VM console in VMware Workstation. Of course, the one that you're looking at right now is a VM console, but there are multiple ways to access the VM console, and it can get a little bit complicated when you have multiple VMs. Let me close this tab, and it prompted me to either suspend the VM, which will preserve the state of the memory for this VM, power off this VM, which is like pulling the power cable on your computer and it will kill the VM, or allow the VM to run in the background, which will keep the VM running in the background and essentially keep it running. And the last option is cancel. I will click on run in background and it says there are no virtual machines. To go back to the virtual machine console, click on the VM on the left side and there we go, we are back at the console. To go full screen on the VM console, click on View menu and click on Full Screen, or you can press Ctrl plus Alt plus Enter and it will take you to the full screen. Now you see a nice little toolbar that is pinned up here by default. If you want to unpin it, simply click on the pin icon and the toolbar is gone. If you want to access the toolbar again, you simply move your mouse again to the top of the screen and you will see the toolbar. And if you want, you can pin it again. And you can see this icon to exit the full screen mode. There are other icons. You can see a thumbnail bar for the VM console of the virtual machine by clicking this icon. Clicking this icon will take you to the Unity mode, which I will show you a little later. The last icon is used for free stretching, which is enabled by default. This option is used to resize the VM console no matter what is the size of the VMware Workstation window. So if I resize the VMware Workstation window, the VM console of Windows 10 virtual machine will automatically resize as well. But if I change from free stretch to keep aspect ratio stretch, notice when I resize this, the aspect ratio of the console inside the VM does stay the same. But I really prefer free stretch, so I'm going to select that option. So these are some tips and tricks that you should be aware of when it comes to accessing the VM console of a virtual machine in VMware Workstation. Let me talk about a cool feature of VMware Workstation, which is Unity mode. The Unity mode allows you to run applications of guest OS of a VM on top of the host operating system. Let me show you how this works. I will open up Microsoft Edge in the VM and navigate to www.vmware.com. I will click on View menu and click Unity, and the VMware Workstation window goes away. Now it looks as if Microsoft Edge browser is running on your host operating system. Unity mode is useful especially when you want to test the applications of guest OS side by side on a Windows host operating system. So if I want to go back to VMware Workstation, click here to exit Unity mode, and we are back into VMware Workstation with the VM console. So that's how easy it is to use VMware Workstation Unity mode, which allows us to run applications from our virtual machine in the host operating system just as if they were natively or actually running on the host. So we installed VMware Workstation and deployed our first virtual machine, which is a Windows 10 VM. But there's a lot more you can do with the virtual lab and VMware Workstation, especially if you want to run different operating systems, which is what I'll be doing in next set of demos. I'll start off by installing a Windows Server 2019 virtual machine in my workstation. Let's get started. We previously discussed that any operating system you install in a virtual machine must be supported by VMware Workstation, and Windows Server 2019 is no different. However, Windows Server 2019 is indeed supported by VMware Workstation, and the first step will be to get the installation media. I usually go to Google and type in Microsoft Windows Server 2019 download, which takes me to the Windows Server 2019 Evaluation Center. In this page, simply select the ISO image and click Continue. Type in your information. Scroll down and click Continue and select your language and click Download. So you'll get a 180 days evaluation version of Windows Server 2019. I've already downloaded this ISO file and saved it on my laptop to save some time. So all we have to do now is go back to VMware Workstation and click on File and click New Virtual Machine to create Windows Server 2019 Virtual Machine. And here keep the default, which is typical recommended, and click Next. I will navigate to the location where I have saved my ISO file. I'll select that and click Open. You can see here it has recognized the ISO file as Windows Server 2019 installation media, and it says that it will use Easy Install feature to install the operating system. Like I mentioned before, Easy Install is a feature in VMware Workstation which works only with certain operating systems such as latest version of Windows and some Linux distributions. This feature will ask you things such as username, password, version of the operating system, and license key. All these things will be configured automatically for you while installing the operating system on the virtual machine along with VMware tools. I will click Next. So these are the questions of Easy Install feature. As I mentioned before, it prompts for product key, which we don't have because we are doing an evaluation version. And it also prompts for the Windows version, username, and password that you want to be configured automatically. For now, I'll skip this and keep them blank and click Next. I will click Yes on the prompt that says I did not enter the license key and I have to manually activate my operating system after it has been installed. Now you can specify a name for the virtual machine. I will keep the default name, which is Windows Server 2019, but I'll change the default location to my D drive, virtual machines, and I'll create a new folder, name this as Windows Server 2019 and click OK. I will click Next. Now on this screen, you can specify the size of your C drive. I will keep the default, which is 60 gig for Windows Server 2019. I will also keep the default option to split this virtual disk into multiple files as opposed to keep this virtual disk as a single file as it can have performance impact. I will click Next here. And now here you are prompted to customize the hardware. I will not customize the hardware right now. And also I will not power on this virtual machine soon after the creation. So I will uncheck this option and click Finish. Alright, you can see the virtual machine has been created. And now I will click on Edit Virtual Machine Settings. And now you can see here The virtual floppy drive is mapped to autoinstall.flp, and this is the floppy image file which will kickstart the easy install of the operating system. Since I don't want to use the easy install feature, either I can disconnect this or I can remove the virtual floppy drive. Also, floppy drives or floppy images are not being used at all. And in this window, we can change things like the memory. For example, I will increase it to 4 GB. We can also change the number of virtual CPUs. You can also add, remove, or change the virtual devices such as NIC, USB, sound card, display, and others by either clicking add or remove. I will remove the virtual devices such as sound card, virtual printer, and USB controller because I'm not going to use them. After making the changes, click on OK. And I will power on this virtual machine. When you see the message to press any key to boot from CD or DVD, simply press a key to boot the Windows Server 2019 installation media. You can now see the Windows logo, which means it is booting from the installation media. We are on the Windows setup screen. I will just keep the default options for language, time and currency format, keyboard or input method, and I will click next. I will click install now. After that, we must choose which versions of Windows Server 2019 we wish to install. We'll be using Windows Server 2019 Standard Evaluation with Desktop Experience, which provides a graphical user interface. I'll click next. We'll accept the license terms and move on to the next step by clicking next. Here we'll choose custom install. Our 60 GB virtual disk is recognized by the installation wizard. So I'll keep that selected, and I'm not going to partition this disk into multiple partitions. So I'm going to click next. So it will begin the installation of Windows Server 2019. The installation, like any Windows Server installation, can take a few minutes. So I will speed up the recording and return when it is done. In between, the VM would be rebooted few times, and that should be okay. After the installation has completed, I will specify a password for our administrator account and press enter. Now it is going to finalize the settings and take us right into the Windows welcome screen where we need to press Ctrl plus Alt plus Delete to unlock this virtual machine. But in VMware Workstation, you would press Ctrl Alt and Insert, which is a keyboard shortcut to unlock Windows lock screen. I will talk more about keyboard shortcuts a little later. So we log in using the password that we set up. And we'll see our Windows Server 2019 desktop. Server Manager automatically starts up, and we can begin configuring our Windows Server 2019 operating system inside the virtual machine. The first step soon after installing a guest OS in VMware Workstation is to install VMware Tools, which provides various capabilities and improves mouse movement, video, and speed. You can see if I move my mouse in the VM console, you may notice a mouse cursor trailing, indicating that my mouse isn't really synced with the host and it can get stuck inside the VM console. Installing VMware Tools will address this as well as increase graphic performance and enables other functions such as file sharing and much more. As recommended, we must ensure that VMware Tools is installed. To install VMware Tools, click on the VM button and click on Install VMware Tools. I will close Server Manager for now and scroll down and open up Windows Explorer. I'll click this PC. And on the D drive, you can see VMware Tools ISO image attached. Double click on that and you can see the installer is launching. Now we are on the welcome screen. I will click next. and I'll select typical as the setup type and click next, and I'll click install, and this just takes a few seconds. And it will flash the screen, which means the video driver has been installed. Once the installation has been completed, click on Finish. Click Yes to restart this virtual machine, and it will restart Windows Server 2019. Once the VM has been rebooted, I will log in back, and I can see improved graphic and mouse performance. So make sure that you install VMware tools in all of your virtual machines if possible. Alright, let me move on to installing another operating system in VMware Workstation. We'll now install Amazon Linux in a virtual machine. Amazon Linux is a Linux distribution used by Amazon AWS in their public cloud. You can run Amazon Linux on your own computer using VMware Workstation, KVM, VirtualBox, or Microsoft Hyper-V. If we go over to this page, it contains the instructions on how you can deploy Amazon Linux to as VM in your on-premises environment. It is a three-step process. The first step is to create a seed.iso boot image, which contains nothing but some predefined parameters for user data such as username and password, and other settings such as host name and network settings. I'll skip this step and directly move on to the next step, which is where you can download an appropriate image for VMware Workstation, KVM, VirtualBox, or Microsoft Hyper-V. But don't worry, you can still define these parameters after the OS has been installed. Back to the second step, I will select VMware, and it will open up a new page. Here you need to download the OVA appliance, which is a VMware image, which actually comes in OVA format, which is the Open Virtualization Appliance. You can import this into VMware Workstation and run Amazon Linux in VMware Workstation. In our case, I've already downloaded the Amazon Linux OVA on my laptop. Alright, let me open up VMware Workstation. I will click File menu and click on Open to select the OVA file that we have already downloaded. I will navigate to the location which has the OVA file. I will select the OVA file and click Open. In this screen, I will type a name for this new virtual machine. Let me call this as Amazon Linux 2. And I will change the default location path for storing the virtual machine. I will save it on my D drive, Virtual Machines, and I'll create a new folder for Amazon Linux 2 and click OK and click Import and wait for a few minutes for the import to complete. Alright, the new virtual machine called Amazon Linux 2 has been created. It has 4 gig of memory, 2 processors, a 25 gig virtual disk, and yes, it even has a virtual floppy drive. If you have seed.iso image, then you need to add a new CD or DVD drive and point it to the seed.iso image and ensure that it is connected at power on. But in my case, I don't have that, so I will skip it. And I will power on this virtual machine. And there we go. It says Amazon Linux. I'll keep that selected and press enter. This virtual machine boots up, and then you can perform your initial configuration. So that's how simple it is to install Amazon Linux in VMware Workstation. I will now show you how to deploy Ubuntu Linux in a virtual machine. To download the Ubuntu image, type Ubuntu in Google search and click on download on ubuntu.com. In here, we can download either Ubuntu Desktop or Ubuntu Server. For this demo, I will use Ubuntu Desktop image. I will click on Ubuntu Desktop and click download for the Ubuntu desktop image of version 2004.3 LTS. I have already downloaded Ubuntu desktop ISO file and saved it on my laptop. But in VMware Workstation, I will click on File menu and click Create a new virtual machine. I will select typical recommended configuration and click Next. I will click on Browse and navigate to the location where I have saved my Ubuntu ISO image. I will select Ubuntu desktop ISO file and click OK. You can see it says Ubuntu was detected and this operating system also supports easy install. I will click next. In the easy install information screen, I will type my full name, a username, a password, and confirm the password again. Easy install will configure these settings for us when Ubuntu desktop is installed. I will click next. I will give a name for this VM and I'll name this as Ubuntu desktop. And for the location, I will change the default location by clicking on Browse. I will select my D drive and select Virtual Machines folder. I will create a new folder under this and call it as Ubuntu Desktop. Click OK and I'll click Next. For the virtual disk, I will keep the default, which is 20 gig, and I will also keep the default option to split the virtual disk into multiple files. Click Next. I'm not going to customize the hardware and I will power on this virtual machine just after it has been created by selecting this option. I will click Finish. The OS boots up and we can see the Ubuntu logo. This will take some time to complete. Ubuntu is creating the file system and now we are copying the files. I'll speed up this video and return when it is completed. Down here, you can see it says the easy install is installing Ubuntu 64-bit and internet connection is required to install OpenVM tools, which is VMware tools for Linux. The installation is completed. Ubuntu desktop will reboot. And now it says installing OpenVM tools. After finishing the setup, we are at the login screen. So we'll click to login and enter the password I've set up during the setup. As you can see, we have successfully deployed Ubuntu desktop as a virtual machine in VMware Workstation and we are logged in and everything appears to be working okay. In fact, the easy install installed the virtual machine tools for us, so our mouse works perfectly here and is synchronized with the host operating system. If we switch to the full screen mode, we can see that we have a really nice Ubuntu desktop virtual machine running inside VMware Workstation. Next in the list is running VMware ESXi as a virtual machine. This one is really useful for IT professionals because there are many of them out there who are interested in learning and testing virtualization platform, especially VMware ESXi. You might already have it installed in your company's data center and want to install it on your Windows desktop or laptop. Maybe you want to gain a VMware certification. Maybe you just want to learn how to administer VMware ESXi for learning and testing purposes. Well, you can run VMware vSphere or the ESXi hypervisor within a virtual machine in VMware Workstation. Let me show you how to do that. Go to my.vmware.com and then click on Products, All Products, and click on Download Product for VMware vSphere. And under here, select your version. So the latest version of VMware vSphere is 7.0. And then click on Go to Downloads next to VMware vSphere Hypervisor ESXi 7.0 U3B. Click on Download. Of course, you need to create a free VMware account and then register for the 60-day evaluation. I have a VMware account and I'm going to log in with that and click Sign In. It's right here that you can click on Download or Download Trial to try vSphere for free, which will provide you a free 60-day evaluation. You can see in my case, Download Now button is grayed out because I have already downloaded this and my 60-day evaluation has expired, but that's okay. I've already downloaded this onto my laptop. It is roughly around 320 meg in size, and we'll use that to create new ESXi VM in VMware Workstation. So just as we did with the previous virtual machines, we'll click on File menu and click on New Virtual Machine. I will again select Typical Recommended and click Next. Now I will choose my ESXi ISO image. I will click Browse and navigate to the location which has my ESXi image. I will select that and click Open. You can see it says VMware ESXi 7 and later detected. I'll click Next. For the virtual machine name, I will name this as ESXi 7. And for the location, I will select my D drive, select my virtual machines folder, click Make New Folder, and name this as ESXi 7 and click OK. Click Next. I will keep the default disk size, which is 142 gig, and I will also keep the default option to split the virtual disk into multiple files and click Next. You can see it has allocated 4 gig of memory for this ESXi and 2 CPUs. I will uncheck power on this virtual machine after creation and I'll click Finish. Alright, the ESXi VM has been created. I will click on Edit Virtual Machine Settings. Here under Processors, there is an important setting for ESXi virtual machine that must be enabled to run nested virtualization. Nested virtualization is nothing but running virtual machines inside of a virtual machine. Since ESXi is a hypervisor and you would end up by running virtual machines on top of the ESXi in most cases, you need to check this option Virtualize Intel VTX or EPT or AMD V or RVI to ensure that you can run VMs on top of this ESXi VM. It is already checked by default and I'll keep it that way. Also, because it is an ESXi VM, 4 gig of memory may not be enough. You may need to increase the memory to at least 8 gig or more, depending upon the features that you are going to enable and number of VMs that you are going to run on top of this VM. Also, you may need to add additional network adapters and additional virtual disks, which again depends on the things which I mentioned before. It is not just additional network adapters that you need to create, but also additional custom networks to simulate a data center physical network. I will talk about how you can create custom networks in the later demos. I'll click Cancel and click on OK. I will power on this virtual machine. The VM has started up and it has loaded the ESXi installer, which may take a few minutes. It detects that we have 2 vCPUs and 4 gig of RAM, and I see VMware ESXi version 7. It says, Welcome to the ESXi 7 installation. So this is simply a regular ESXi installation from here. I'll press Enter to continue and press F11 to accept the license terms. And it has selected our virtual disk, which is of 142 gig in size. And this is where we are going to install the ESXi operating system. So I'll keep that selected and press Enter to continue. I will select US default as the keyboard layout and I'll press Enter to continue. And I'll specify a root password and press Enter to continue. And I'll press F11 to start the installation. Let's give this a minute to finish. Alright, the ESXi has been installed successfully. I will press Enter to reboot. This will take another minute. And now VMware ESXi or the vSphere hypervisor has booted up, and you can administer this host from the IP address 192.168.233.131. So if I open my browser and type in the IP address 192.168.233.131, it tells us that this page is not secure, which is okay. I will ignore the default security warning and click Advanced and click Proceed to the IP. I will log in as root and the password that we set up during the ESXi installation. And we are connected to a virtual VMware vSphere host, which is running virtual ESXi host running as a virtual machine in VMware Workstation. Let me now talk about how to run containers in virtual machines. Containers are a popular technology these days, and both system administrators and developers should be familiar with them. Just so you know, containers can run on any newer operating systems of Windows Server, Windows Desktop, or most Linux distributions by default. To run containers, you don't require VMware Workstation. You can run both Linux and Windows containers. However, many people continue to use VMware Workstation to run containers because they wish to run containers across several operating systems. Containers can, for example, run under Windows Server, Ubuntu, or Amazon Linux. On a Ubuntu VM, let me show you how to run a container. I will open a terminal window here and I will type sudo apt install docker.io. So this will install the Docker, and then you can download the containers and run them on this Ubuntu Linux VM. So that's how simple it is to run containers within a virtual machine in your lab. It is now time to show how to use VMware Workstation to connect and manage VMware vSphere virtual machines running in your data center. If you already have VMware vSphere environment running in your data center, you can connect and manage it using VMware Workstation. Click File and click Connect to Server and type either the IP address, host name, or fully qualified domain name of your ESXi host or vCenter server. I will type the IP address of my ESXi host, which is 192.168.1.99, and I'll type the root credentials of my ESXi host and click Connect. So you can see my ESXi host has been added on the left side, and if I expand, I can see all my VMs running on my ESXi host. And on the right side, you can check the CPU usage of the host, RAM utilization, and information about the disk space usage of the data stores connected to my ESXi host. You can also build a new virtual machine which will end up as a VM running on this ESXi host. I will click on Create a new virtual machine. I will just click through here and keep all the defaults. And look at that. We just created a new VM, and this VM is not running in VMware Workstation. Instead, it is running on my ESXi host. And I can see the recent tasks here which says create virtual machine, and it is succeeded. I can restart the host, shut down the host, or enter the host into maintenance mode. I have full control over this host running in my data center. So this is how you connect and manage VMware vSphere VMs. Networking is very important for virtual machines, and VMware Workstation has an excellent tool to customize the virtual networks called Virtual Network Editor. To access it, click on Edit and click on Virtual Network Editor. Here is the tool. By default, you will not be able to make any changes here until you click on Change Settings using Administrative Privileges. I will talk about these settings in detail in the later demos, but be careful when you make changes in here. Any misconfiguration can lead to network connectivity issues for the virtual machines. But for now, just be aware that this tool is available to customize virtual networking for your virtual machines running in VMware Workstation. Also, by default, there are three different virtual networks: host-only network, bridge network, and NAT network. Bridge network is mapped to VMnet 0, host-only network is mapped to VMnet 1, and NAT network is mapped to VMnet 8. You can create the additional network of these network types by clicking on Add Network, and you can create up to 20 different types of network. So when you create a network, it will actually create additional virtual network adapters on your host OS. So let me show you that. You can see there is a VMnet 1 virtual network adapter, which is my host only network, and there is VMnet 8 virtual network adapter, which is my NAT network. So if I create additional networks in virtual network editor, then it will create additional virtual network adapters on my host. I will close the virtual network editor window and go back to the settings of my virtual machine. When we look at its network adapter, by default, this virtual machine is connected to NAT network. If you want to connect this virtual machine to a different network, then you can select one of the other options shown here, which is bridged, host only, or any custom network that you create in virtual network editor. So let me talk more about these different types of virtual networks. The first one is the bridged virtual network, which is tied to VMnet 0. This network is used to connect virtual machines directly to the network adapter that your host computer is connected to. So it's just like those virtual machines were connected to a bridge and they are sharing the network connection with your physical host. In other words, both a virtual machine and the host are connected to the same network. So the VM will have access to other machines on the network, and other machines on the network can communicate with this VM as if it were a physical computer on the same network. Bridge networking works with both wired and wireless host network adapters. And then there is the NAT network, which means that your virtual machine are given a DHCP IP address by VMware DHCP service, and then they use network address translation via the host IP address to communicate out on the network. In the default configuration, virtual machines get an address on this NAT network from the virtual DHCP server. DHCP is an acronym for Dynamic Host Control Protocol. A DHCP server is a system that uses the DHCP protocol to assign IP addresses to the devices on the network. So you can see in this diagram, the VMware DHCP service has assigned a DHCP IP 10.10.10.1 to my virtual machine. So what would this NAT do? NAT would take an IP address and translates into another IP address. In other words, when a VM sends a request to access a network resources, let's say a web page, to the web server hosting the web page, it appears as if the request came from the host machine. So you can see this diagram. The host IP address is 192.168.1.2 and the request from the VM is forwarded to the web server using the host IP address. In VMware Workstation, the NAT network is tied to VMnet 8 by default. So I showed you this earlier. So it is a virtual network adapter on my host computer. This VMnet 8 is able to connect to the public external network using the translated IP addresses enabled by a feature called port forwarding, which allows incoming web traffic to pass through a specific port chosen by the administrator to the internal network. All this happens in the background, so you don't have to change anything. So NAT is useful when you have a limited supply of IP addresses. Finally, there is host-only network, which is tied to VMnet 1, which is just what it sounds like. It creates a private internal network for the VMs to connect to, similar to a NAT network, but without IP address translation. So the host-only networks are for the VMs that stay in the private network or in an isolated network. and do not have direct access to the external network such as the host OS network or internet. But the VMs on host-only network using the same VMnet can talk to each other. This VMnet1 is actually a virtual network adapter on the host computer. So again, if I go to my network connections, you can see VMnet1 is a virtual network adapter on my host computer. This network would be useful if you need to set up an isolated virtual network. If you use host-only networking, your virtual machine and the host virtual adapter are connected to private Ethernet network. Addresses on this type of network are also provided by a DHCP service. Next, we'll go through more advanced virtual app settings, beginning with creating virtual networks. We'll go through various examples for constructing your own custom virtual networks, and I'll walk you through the process. We previously discussed how virtual machines are connected to virtual network adapters, and those virtual network adapters are connected to virtual networks, and those virtual networks are connected out to physical networks or physical adapters on the host. Sometimes these virtual networks that act as isolated or host-only networks are not connected to a host adapter. In this demo, I will create a custom virtual network and connect two virtual machines to this custom private network so that these two virtual machines can communicate with each other. To create the custom virtual network, click on Edit and click Virtual Network Editor. You can see we have two virtual networks called VMnet1 and VMnet8 as explained before. VMnet1 is the host-only network, and any VM connected to this network can only communicate with the host only if you keep this option Connect a Host Virtual Adapter to this network checked. Otherwise, only the VMs connected to this network can communicate with each other but not with the host. The VMs connected to VMnet1 will receive dynamic IP address via DHCP as they are on 192.168.142.0 subnet. VMnet8 on the other hand is a network address translation NAT network, so any VMs connected to this network will receive an IP address on the 192.168.233.0 subnet, and then they can communicate with each other as well as communicate externally using the host's physical network connection. By the way, all the VMs that we have created so far in this lab are connected to VMnet8 NAT network. So I'm going to create a custom network. I will click on Change Settings, and it will relaunch the virtual network editor as administrator to make changes. After launching this tool as an administrator, you can see there is another network here called Bridged Network mapped to VMnet0. So any virtual machine connected to this will be bridged with the host's physical network adapter, and they can receive an IP address via the DHCP server on the LAN network to which the physical host is connected, and they will have a dynamic IP address just like the physical host running VMware Workstation or any other server or node on your network. And if this option is checked, use local DHCP service to distribute IP address to VMs, then they should receive an IP address via the DHCP server on the LAN network to which the physical host is connected, and they will have a dynamic IP address just like the physical host running VMware Workstation or any other server or node on your network. Back to our task, I will click Add Network, and I'll keep the default here, VM network number, which is VMnet2, and I'll click OK. And we can also create additional virtual networks by clicking Add Network, and we can create up to 19 different virtual networks. You can see the VMnet2 is created and it is listed here. By default, this is a host-only network, which means the VMs connected to this network can communicate with each other, but not with any other network. And again, by default, the host virtual network adapter connected to this network is checked. You can see here. which means the host will be able to communicate on this network. If you uncheck this option, the host computer will not be able to communicate on this network or the VMs connected to this network. I will keep this checked. We can also specify here if we want DHCP to be enabled on this virtual network. You can see by default DHCP IP address will be provided by VMware Workstation. I will click DHCP settings and I can specify the DHCP settings for this custom virtual network that is being created. I will click cancel, but if I uncheck this option use local DHCP service, then we need to specify static IPs to our VMs. I'll keep this checked, but you can also use a Windows DHCP server as a VM on this custom virtual network to get IP addresses assigned via DHCP. Alright, a custom VM Net2 is created. Next, I will rename this network by clicking the button Rename Network. Instead of VMnet2, I will call this as Production and click OK. So now it has its own custom name. It's a custom and private network. I will click Apply and click OK. Now I will connect my Windows 10 and Windows Server 2019 VM to this custom network VMnet2. So I will click Edit Virtual Machine Settings and connect the network adapter to the custom network VMnet2, which is Production, Host Only. I'll click OK. I will edit the settings for Windows Server 2019 VM. Click the network adapter and it is already selected to Production. Click OK. Now I'll power on both these VMs. So I will log into these VMs and I will find the IP address of these VMs. I'll type ipconfig and the IP address is 192.168.174.129. My Windows 10 VM is 192.168.174.128. So if I try to ping that IP of my Windows Server 2019 from my Windows 10, it will not ping because the Windows firewall is turned on both these VMs. So if I turn off the Windows firewall and if I try to ping again, the ping succeeds. So with this small demo, I hope you understand the possibilities that Virtual Network Editor provides to create custom networks to simulate data center physical networks. The ability to take snapshots and then revert back is very useful and powerful in Virtual Lab when you want to do multiple tests, configuration changes, or upgrades. So a snapshot is like a point-in-time capture of virtual machine's disk file and optionally the memory as well. And it can capture the exact state of a running virtual machine. If I right-click on any of these virtual machines and go into Snapshot, you can see I have an option to take a snapshot. And I can also use the Snapshot Manager, which is a useful tool provided by VMware Workstation that allows us to take snapshots. Let me take a snapshot. I'll click on Take Snapshot and give a name to the snapshot. I will call this Before Upgrade. And you can optionally type in some description here. I'll click Take Snapshot. And it has created a snapshot with the name we provided. You can see the snapshot here before upgrade and then the current state of the virtual machine. I will close the Snapshot Manager and create a new folder on the desktop of the guest OS. I will call this folder as First Upgrade Task. Now let me go back to the Snapshot Manager. Assume that we performed our upgrade, things went wrong, and we now wish to return to the before upgrade snapshot. For that, just click on Go To, and it will prompt whether we want to go back or revert to previous snapshot. I will click on No, and I will save this so-called not working state as first upgrade by taking a snapshot and click on Take Snapshot. So you can see it has created the first upgrade snapshot. Now I will select the before upgrade snapshot and click on Go To. I will click Yes this time, and it will take me to the previous state of this virtual machine, which is before the first upgrade. You can see the current state of the virtual machine, and the folder that we created to simulate the upgrade on this virtual machine is no longer there. So we have reverted back to the before upgrade snapshot now. If we go back to the snapshot manager, we went back in time, and it also says you are here, which is on the before upgrade snapshot. Back to the VM console, I will create another folder, call this as second upgrade, and I will go back to the snapshot manager. I can create another snapshot here, and it will build a nice tree which tells us where we are right now in the snapshot tree, and this gives us a great way to perform multiple upgrades on the VMs and preserve those states. You may notice an option for auto protect. It is a feature of VMware Workstation that is quite useful, and you can enable this for per virtual machine basis. If I click on auto protect button, it will take us to the settings of the VM, and under options tab you can see the auto protect option. It's already clicked on that, and it will provide you to take a snapshot every day, every hour, every half hour, and then save a certain number of these snapshots on disk. I will check this option, enable auto protect, and if you set your auto protect interval to every day and set 10 as maximum auto protect snapshots, so it will take 4 snapshots every day and 3 snapshots every week and 3 snapshots every month. But it will consume a fair amount of disk space. It says a minimum of 40 gig of disk space is required. I'm going to keep this option checked, and it is a useful feature of VMware Workstation that you can enable on a virtual machine, and it provides a type of automatic backup for your virtual machine. So that's how VMware Workstation VM snapshots work, and again this is useful for anyone setting up a virtual lab for testing, training, or development purpose. If you want to share a file or folder with the guest VM from the host machine, or want to copy something from the virtual machine to the host, then VMware Workstation provides file or folder sharing option. To set it up, navigate to the virtual machine settings, and then click the Options tab, and click Shared Folders section. This will be disabled by default, and to enable it, it requires VMware tools to be installed in the virtual machine. And to enable it, simply click Always Enable, and there's an option to map a network drive in the Windows guest operating system, which is really amazing. So I'm going to check this option, and I'm going to click Add. I will click Next on the welcome screen, and I'm going to select the folder which I'm going to share by clicking Browse. I will select the Documents folder on my host OS, and this will be the folder which I'm going to share it on my guest OS. So I'm going to click OK. And this will be called Documents as well by default, but to differentiate it, I will call it as Host Documents, and I'll click Next, and I'll keep the option Enable this share selected. I don't want to make it read only, so I'm going to click Finish. I will click OK here. And then inside my virtual machine, if I open up Windows Explorer and click on this PC, you can see how it mapped the drive on this virtual machine as Z drive, and it is mapped to the Documents folder of my host OS. Now I can create a new text file inside this folder, and I will name this as From the Guest VM Important Document. And now on my host OS, if I open up Explorer window and go to the Documents folder, and here is the important document from the guest virtual machine. I'll open it up and make some changes and save it. I'll go back to the virtual machine and open up the same document, and you can see the changes which I made to this document on my host OS. So in any virtual lab, file or folder sharing is critical. The ability to exchange files back and forth from the host to the guest, and this even works if the guest isn't on the same network as the host, as long as the VMware tools are installed. So that's how simple it is to transfer files in and out of a guest virtual machine in VMware Workstation. Let's look at the default location for files of the virtual machines. If I go to Edit and click on Preferences in VMware Workstation, in the workspace, you will see a default locations for the virtual machines, and it defaults to my user profile and then documents and a folder called virtual machines. To change the default location, you can click on Browse and you can point it to another folder or another drive. It can be external or internal, but ensure you select a faster drive. Otherwise, the virtual machine startup and their performance will be impacted. I will change this to D drive and virtual machines folder, where I have saved all my virtual machines on this computer, and I will click OK. And let me click OK again. Let me go into D drive virtual machines folder. Inside this folder, I can see a folder for each virtual machine. If I go into a VM folder, there are number of different files that you can see. For example, you can see the lock folders with .lck extension, which are used to protect the VMs and their files from being deleted. They will be there if your VMs are powered on. You can also see a lot of VMware virtual disk files, and they actually make up the virtual disk. And they roughly consume around 9.63 GB of disk space. In other words, we configured a single 60 gig virtual disk for this Windows Server 2019 VM, but the actual usage of the virtual disk is around 10 gig right now. As and when additional data is added to the disk from the guest OS, the virtual disk size grows. We also have vmem files, which is a memory or swap file for the virtual machine. In fact, we have three different vmem files. That's because the virtual machine is running on snapshots. And you can also see the snapshot metadata file. Scrolling down, we can see the virtual machine snapshot file and also the snapshot disk file, which has the snapshot numbers. So you can see here we have all the snapshot disk files of snapshot number 1, and they have been represented by this number 000001. And the second snapshot disk file is actually represented by this number 000003. And there is an important file, the virtual machine configuration file. If we open this file in Notepad, it actually shows the configuration of this virtual machine. This configuration file lists out all virtual devices and their configuration. You can see things like the virtual network device, virtual memory size, number of vCPUs, the virtual machine disk file, and you can see currently the VM is running on the snapshot disk file, the type of operating system, and many other configuration details. Also, when you create a new virtual machine, if I go to File and click New Virtual Machine and click through here, and you get a prompt which asks you to specify the virtual machine location for storing its file. It is easy to change the default location somewhere else if you are running low on disk space or need a better performance by using the faster disk. So that's all you need to know about VM files and the default location for VMs. You're going to spend quite a bit of time in the virtual machine library when using VMware Workstation Virtual Lab. This is where you can find and navigate to all virtual machines, both the virtual machines running locally on your computer as well as any shared VMs that you have access to. The shared access includes the VMs running in an ESXi server or vCenter server. To make a virtual machine as a favorite VM and bring it to top of the list, simply click on the star icon, and clicking on the drop-down icon, you can only show all VMs, favorite VMs, and powered on VMs only. You can also search for the VM by either typing the complete name up here, and it will show all the VMs that starts with that name. Let's say I will type Win, And you can see it has showed all the VMs that starts with the word Win, which includes Windows 10 and Windows Server 2019. But if you want, you can type in the complete name. This feature will be super useful when you have many virtual machines to search for. These are few ways to find virtual machines in your library. You also have a tabbed interface that shows all your running virtual machines, and you can scroll through them using this tabbed interface. There's also a tray icon for VMware Workstation in the system tray, and if you right click on it, you can open VMware Workstation, suspend all virtual machines, shut down all virtual machines, pause all virtual machines, open all background virtual machines, or just exit Workstation completely. Let me suspend all virtual machines, and you can see all virtual machines are suspended. To resume the virtual machine, just click on Resume this virtual machine, and they will be resumed. In this demo, I will show you how you can organize your virtual machines using folders and tabs in VMware Workstation. In VMware Workstation, you can create folders. So if you right click in the library section, click on new folder. I will say Windows VMs, and I will create another folder, call this as Linux VMs. And I will move all my Windows VMs into Windows VMs folder, and I will move all my Linux VMs into Linux VMs folder. In the tabs section, you can reorder them the way you want. So I can move this Windows VMs folders as the first item in the tabs section, and I can move Linux VMs as the third item in the tabs section. Or you can reorder them right next to each other. If you go to the Windows folder tabs here, you can see the virtual machines running under Windows tabs. And you can also easily switch back and forth between different virtual machines running in VMware Workstation using the tabs menu. Or you can also press Ctrl plus Tab for the next tab, or Ctrl plus Shift plus Tab for the previous tab to show the previous VM. It is useful if you have more virtual machines running in VMware Workstation. Folders are also a good feature in VMware Workstation, so it helps you to organize and segregate your virtual machines. You can also switch between different virtual machines as well as folders. When you click on a folder, you can change from Details view all the way from small to large thumbnails. And this view would be useful when you have multiple virtual machines running. So this is how you can use tabs and folders to help better organize your VMware Workstation Virtual Lab. There are some hotkey navigation that you need to be aware of. I already talked about Ctrl plus Tab, which moves to the next tab, and Ctrl Shift plus Tab, which moves to the previous tab. You can see these hotkeys as menus in the tabs menu. These hotkeys work for both virtual machines as well as folders and make switching between VMs very easy. The other hotkeys can be found in Preferences. Click on the Edit menu and click on Preferences. Click Hotkeys, and you see there are a number of hotkeys available. The hotkeys in VMware Workstation uses 4 keystrokes such as Ctrl, Shift, Alt, and Windows buttons. If you ever want to change them, you can modify them here. To release control from a current virtual machine, if you don't have VMware tools installed, the hotkey is Ctrl plus Alt. To enter or leave full screen mode, it is Ctrl plus Alt plus Enter. To switch to the previous full screen virtual machine, it's Ctrl Alt left arrow. To switch to the next full screen virtual machine, it is Ctrl plus Alt plus right arrow. And to show the multiple monitor layout, it is Ctrl plus Alt plus M. I will click Cancel here. Down here it says to return to your host computer, press Ctrl plus Alt. And if I press that, now it will say to direct input to this VM, click inside the VM, or press Ctrl plus G. On a Windows VM, you would typically press Ctrl plus Alt plus Delete to unlock the lock screen. But on a VMware Workstation Windows VM, to unlock the lock screen, you would press Ctrl plus Alt plus Insert. And if I press Ctrl plus Alt plus Enter, it will go to the full screen. And if I press Ctrl plus Alt plus Enter again, it will exit from the full screen back to the single window mode. Let me go back to the full screen. And if you would like to switch between the Windows VM and the Amazon Linux 2 VM when we are in the full screen mode, the hotkey combination is Ctrl Alt right arrow to go to the full screen mode of Amazon Linux 2 VM and left arrow to move back to the Windows Server 2019 full screen mode. Also, if we had multiple monitors, we could use Ctrl plus Alt plus M, but that does not work since we don't. So these are some of the good to know hotkeys in VMware Workstation. I've discussed a lot about virtual hardware in this course, including virtual CPUs, virtual memory, virtual disks, and virtual interface cards. Virtual hardware exists in every virtual machine, and they have something called as version number. All the hardware on the virtual machine has a specific version. Let me show you what I mean. I have clicked on my Windows Server 2019 VM on the left side, and if we go to the VM menu and click Manage, we can change hardware compatibility. Since the VM is powered on, this option is grayed out. So let me power off this VM and right click on the VM, go into Manage and click on Change Hardware Compatibility. It will open up Change Hardware Compatibility wizard. I will click Next. You can see the current hardware compatibility is set to Workstation Beta. There is virtual hardware compatibility for just about every version of VMware Workstation and also for VMware ESXi. Now the virtual hardware compatibility of this virtual machine can be changed to different hardware compatibility versions. You can see each version of hardware compatibility has few limitations. For the current hardware version compatibility that is set to Workstation Beta, there are few limitations such as maximum memory of 128 gig, 32 processors, 10 network adapters, 8 TB disk size, 8 gig of shared graphics memory, and it is also compatible with Fusion Beta and Workstation Beta only. For example, if we select Workstation 16, it has same set of limitations as the previous one, but it is additionally compatible with Fusion 12.x and Workstation 16.x versions. But if we select VMware Workstation version 6, you can see here how it goes down to 8 gig of memory, 2 processors, 950 gig of disk size, and no SATA devices, no NVMe, no CPU hot plug, no printer support. So these are some of the limitations. It is typically recommended to set the virtual hardware compatibility version to maximum level as it will give you maximum scalability for the VM. In this case, it is VMware Workstation Beta. But sometimes you may need to select few versions lower to ensure that the VMs would be compatible with apps running inside of the guest OS or due to limitations of the guest OS. It can become a limitation as well if you are planning to migrate the VM from VMware Workstation and a different hypervisor such as ESXi or VMware Fusion. During that time, you may need to downgrade the virtual hardware compatibility to migrate the VM. Also, VMware Workstation will ask you whether you want to upgrade the virtual hardware compatibility of a virtual machine on a regular basis. And I usually recommend that you reply yes and go ahead and do so. It just takes a few seconds to upgrade virtual hardware compatibility. The ability to clone virtual machines is quite important when creating a virtual lab, and VMware Workstation provides two types of cloning. I will show you those two options little later. I'll right click on my Windows Server 2019 virtual machine and select Manage, you can see Clone option here. Click on Clone and it opens up the welcome screen of the Clone Virtual Machine wizard. You can see it says you cannot make a clone of a virtual machine or a snapshot that is powered on or suspended. This means we first need to shut down this virtual machine. I'll click Cancel. Let me shut down this VM. Alright, the VM has been shut down. Right click again on the virtual machine and go into Manage and click on Clone. Now in the Clone Virtual Machine wizard, I will click Next. You can either create a clone from the current virtual machine or from a snapshot if it is available. I don't have a snapshot on this VM, so I will click Next. Here are the two different types of clones available, linked clone and full clone. The first one, linked clone, is the default. With a linked clone, the clone of the virtual machine that you create is permanently linked to the virtual disk of the original source virtual machine that you cloned from it. And if you ever delete the original VM, the VM from which you cloned will no longer function. But the advantage of a linked clone is that the only disk space consumed, this would mean the linked clones would consume less space. But of course, the disk consumption and the space required would be very small to start with. However, the disk consumption will expand over time as you use that VM more frequently, although it may not grow considerably. You can create multiple VMs by using linked clone, and they take up very little disk space and they are so quick to create. A full clone, on the other hand, is a complete copy. It is an exact replica of the source VM, which means it needs same disk space and it will take much longer to clone depending on the size of the virtual disks. So let's make a linked clone. I'll select Create a linked clone and click Next. I will call this linked clone as Windows Server 2019 Test 1 and I'll click Finish. Click Close, and there we go. We just created a linked clone and it was super fast. Before I power on this linked VM, I will edit settings for this VM and disconnect the CD or DVD drive to ensure that it will not boot from the ISO installation media, and I'm going to click OK. Now I will power on this VM. And that's it. This is how the VMs are cloned in VMware Workstation. One of the security features of VMware Workstation is the ability to encrypt VMs, which is really simple to implement. To encrypt a virtual machine, first shut down the VM. I'll click Shut Down. Then go into the virtual machine settings. Under the Options tab, scroll down to the Access Control and click Encrypt to encrypt the virtual machine. You'll need to specify a password and confirm the password again. And also store the password somewhere safe, because if you lose password, you'll be locked out of the virtual machine forever. Click Encrypt. Keep in mind that the encryption process might take a long time, from few minutes to few hours. So we'll just encrypt a VM here, and I hope it does not take too long for this VM. And so I'll just give it a few minutes to finish. Alright, the virtual machine got encrypted. And if you want to change the password for the encryption key, we can change the password here. So we have to type the current password and the new password. I'll click Cancel. And if you want to remove the encryption, you can click Remove Encryption and it will ask for the password. And removing the encryption will no longer protect this virtual machine. So I'll click Cancel. I'll click on OK and I'll power on this virtual machine. And that's how easy it is to enable encryption on a virtual machine in VMware Workstation. It is a common practice to bring virtual machines into your VMware Workstation lab from another source such as ESXi or a VM that you downloaded from internet. Typically, these VMs on the internet are downloaded as virtual appliances. In this video course, I already showed you how to import a virtual appliance which would be in a OVA format and that runs as a VM. We did this step with Amazon Linux too by clicking File and clicking on Open. And you can see here for the supported file type, the VMware Workstation supports OVA and OVA files for the import. Another internet source from where you can download the virtual appliances is VMware Marketplace. I always recommend that you download these virtual appliances from a trusted source, especially when you are downloading them from internet. Another option would be to use the option Virtualize a Physical Machine, which actually requires to install VMware vCenter Converter standalone tool. It is a free tool used for converting physical host into a virtual machine as well as performing a conversion of virtual machine running on other platform into a virtual machine in VMware Workstation. And with that, we have completed the learning of VMware Workstation version 16 on Windows. Together, we completed this course on creating a virtual lab with VMware Workstation. Congratulations! I hope that you have really enjoyed the course and learned a lot. At this point, hopefully you have created your own really awesome virtual lab with VMware Workstation, and you can start reaping all the benefits. If you are looking for some additional resources, of course I recommend the VMware Workstation documentation over at docs.vmware.com. It's a great resource, and I also recommend the VMware Hands-On Labs. They do a great job as well in helping you gain access to other VMware products. If you have any questions on this video course, please comment it in this video and I will try to answer them as much as possible. Hope you enjoy this learning. If you would like to say thank you to me, you can click on the thanks button, and any little donation matters to me. It would help me to put up more technical contents like this for free. I again thank you for watching this video. For more videos like these, please like and share the video. Also, please subscribe to my channel.